The Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi confrontation was never just a feud between a former rebel Democrat and the woman who once embodied democratic institutional power. It became important because it grew into a larger fight over who gets to claim the language of national security legitimacy after trust in the intelligence state, the party establishment, and the old post-9/11 consensus all began to crack at once. That is the real story. Not simply Tulsi Gabbard breaking with her old party and ending up in Donald Trump's national security world. Not simply Nancy Pelosi representing the Democratic old guard that Gabbard once openly challenged. But a much deeper struggle over whether the people who built and defended the old national security architecture still deserve to define what responsible governance looks like when that architecture no longer commands the same confidence it once did. That is why this pair matters. Because Pelosi is not just a retired speaker in waiting. She remains, even on her way out of Congress, one of the most durable symbols of democratic institutional stewardship. And Gabbard is not just another cabinet figure. She represents the anti-establishment critique that says the intelligence and security establishment used the language of patriotism, professionalism, and classified authority to protect itself from accountability for too long. When those two figures are set against each other, the conflict becomes bigger than biography. It becomes a war over custodianship. Recent events gave that war fresh relevance. Reuters reported in February 2026 that Gabbard shut down the Directors Initiatives Group, a task force she had created to root out politicization in intelligence agencies but that critics had denounced as a partisan weapon. Reuters also reported on the controversy around her presence at an FBI raid in Georgia and on her office's investigation into voting systems in Puerto Rico, both of which triggered concern from Democratic leaders about whether the intelligence apparatus was straying into domestic political terrain. At the same time, Reuters reported in late 2025 that Pelosi would retire from Congress, marking the formal end of one of the longest and most institutionally influential careers in Democratic leadership. That combination matters. It means the old guardian is leaving just as one of the most dramatic anti-guardian figures is helping run the intelligence state. That is the confrontation. Gabbard wants the public to believe the real danger comes from security institutions that became arrogant, politicized, and protected by their own aura of expertise. Pelosi's political tradition wants the public to believe the real danger comes when anti-establishment distrust is used to hollow out the very institutions that keep democratic government from sliding into improvisation, conspiracy, and loyalty politics. That is the whole fight. To understand it, start with Gabbard. Gabbard's power has always come from making official certainty look compromised. Even before entering Trump's orbit, she had built a reputation around challenging interventionism, intelligence orthodoxy, and party discipline. What makes her different from a routine dissenter is that she can make suspicion sound principled rather than merely chaotic. She does not present herself as anti-state in a simple sense. She presents herself as anti-corruption within the state, anti-manipulation within the state, anti-politicization within the state. That sounds attractive in an age of distrust. But it also creates danger. Once you claim the institutions are so compromised that extraordinary intervention is needed to cleanse them, you can justify a great deal. Oversight can turn theatrical. Normal guardrails can start looking like obstacles planted by the compromised order itself. Critics of Gabbard hear that risk everywhere in her tenure. They do not hear reform. They hear a national security structure being pushed toward partisan mission under a banner of de-weaponization. Pelosi, by contrast, comes from the age of the guarded center. Her kind of authority depends on the belief that institutions, however flawed, still require disciplined custodians who respect process, hierarchy, and coalition maintenance. Pelosi always understood power as something organized, counted, sequenced, and protected. That is why she became so formidable. She was not simply ideological. She was architectural. She believed institutions had to be made to function, because when they stop functioning, stronger and less scrupulous actors fill the vacuum. That is why Gabbard alarms Pelosi's tradition so deeply. She is not just questioning a policy. She is questioning whether the old custodians ever deserved the moral monopoly they claimed. And in a low-trust age, that question can be explosive. There is also a symbolic justice in the pair. Gabbard once represented an internal democratic revolt against establishment gatekeepers. Pelosi represented the very center of that gatekeeping order. Their divergence now captures something larger than personal history. It captures the implosion of an older democratic consensus about security, patriotism, and legitimacy. What used to be an intra-party tension has become an inter-system tension. One side says the state must be defended from reckless dismantling. The other says the state cannot be defended honestly until its own manipulations are dragged into the light. That is why the confrontation keeps mattering even without a daily exchange of quotes. Pelosi stands for an era in which institutional continuity was itself a moral good. Gabbard stands for an era in which continuity itself can sound like evidence of cover-up. Those are radically different moods. And modern politics is often less about doctrine than about mood. Gabbard's mood is that of exposure. Pelosi's mood is that of containment. Gabbard wants to tear away the aura around intelligence authority. Pelosi wants to prevent democratic life from being overwhelmed by suspicion that can never be satisfied. Both positions speak to real fears. That is what makes the pair valuable. There is another layer too: retirement and succession. Reuters' report on Pelosi's decision not to seek re-election was about more than one career ending. It marked the passing of a whole style of democratic power, disciplined, institutional, committee-minded, intensely procedural even when ideologically fierce. Gabbard's prominence inside Trump's national security world marks something different, a style of power suspicious of the very institutions Pelosi spent decades mastering. One era tries to preserve legitimacy through process. The other tries to reclaim legitimacy by attacking the myths that process once hid behind. That is why the pair belongs in long form. It lets you tell the story of American national security politics not just as left versus right, but as guardian versus defector, architecture versus exposure, procedural legitimacy versus post-establishment cleansing. And maybe that is the best way to state the stakes. Tulsi Gabbard and Nancy Pelosi are fighting over who still has the right to call a national security institution legitimate. Pelosi's world says legitimacy comes from disciplined stewardship, stable procedures, and the refusal to let distrust destroy the machinery of government. Gabbard's world says legitimacy cannot survive if that same machinery is treated as sacred after using secrecy and authority to protect its own political assumptions. Pelosi fears the collapse of trusted structure. Gabbard fears the survival of corrupted structure. Pelosi wants the country to remember what institutions prevent. Gabbard wants the country to remember what institutions can hide. That is why the confrontation lasts. Because America has not decided whether its deeper wound is too little faith in the national security state, or too much unearned faith that lingered for too long. Until that question is settled, the Gabbard-Pelosi conflict will keep echoing long after Pelosi leaves Congress and long after the current headlines move on. Because it is not really about two women from the same party's past. It is about who gets to inherit the language of responsibility after the old responsible class has lost its monopoly on trust.